the midst of heated political discourse and media attention surrounding the ongoing presidential debates in the United States, a significant yet largely overlooked legislative change has quietly taken place in the United Kingdom. On October 1, 2024, a new law was enacted that requires all individuals keeping poultry or other captive birds to register their flocks immediately if they had not already done so. This law was introduced to strengthen biosecurity measures and improve the UK's response to potential outbreaks of avian diseases. However, not everyone is happy with this news. It carries serious implications for farmers, hobbyists, and anyone involved in poultry or bird keeping in the UK, marking a pivotal moment in the country's management of animal health and agriculture. While the new UK law, requiring the immediate registration of all poultry and captive birds, has been introduced with the goal of enhancing biosecurity and preventing the spread of avian diseases, it has not been universally well received. A vocal segment of bird keepers, particularly those who have chosen to live sustainably or off-grid, are expressing their frustration and concerns about what they see as government overreach into their way of life. These individuals, who often rely on raising their own poultry for eggs, meat, and other resources as part of a self-sustaining lifestyle, argue that the new regulations are an unnecessary intrusion into their private lives and a deliberate attempt to discourage sustainable living. For many sustainable and off-grid livers, self-sufficiency is not just a lifestyle choice, it is a deeply held philosophy centered on independence, environmental stewardship, and resilience. They view raising poultry and other birds as a crucial element of their efforts to reduce their reliance on external systems like supermarkets and industrial food production. These bird keepers see the new requirement to register their flocks with the government as an infringement on their personal freedom and a bureaucratic step that goes against the very principles of autonomy and sustainability that they have built their lives around. One of the primary complaints from sustainable livers is that the law introduces an additional layer of government control over what they consider to be a private and self-sustaining activity. Many feel that registering their birds is the first step toward increased regulation and monitoring of their way of life, fearing that the government may eventually impose further restrictions or mandates that interfere with their ability to live independently. Some bird keepers have voiced concerns that registering their flocks could lead to forced compliance with future regulations, such as mandatory vaccinations or even culling, in the event of an avian influenza outbreak, regardless of the size or isolation of their flocks. For those who value privacy and self-sufficiency, the idea of handing over personal information about their lifestyle choices, such as the number and location of birds they keep, feels like an unnecessary intrusion. Some argue that small-scale bird keepers, especially those in rural or remote areas, should be exempt from such regulations, as their flocks pose little to no threat to national biosecurity compared to large industrial poultry farms. A common theme among those protesting the new law is the belief that government regulations are gradually encroaching on personal freedoms, particularly when it comes to sustainable living practices. Many sustainable livers argue that this law is just one more example of bureaucratic overreach, which threatens to erode their ability to manage their own food production without state interference. They point out that while the law is ostensibly about controlling disease outbreaks, it unfairly targets small-scale hobbyist bird keepers, people who often raise their birds under natural, healthy conditions compared to large industrial farms, which tend to operate under far more intensive and confined conditions. One farmer said that this law is a slippery slope, saying that first they make farmers and families register their birds, next they'll be telling owners how to raise them, and before you know it, they'll be controlling every aspect of food production. There is also skepticism about whether the government can effectively manage the registration process and use the data in a meaningful way. Some small-scale bird keepers worry that the registration system will create unnecessary red tape and bureaucracy, adding stress and confusion to what should be a simple and natural practice. Many fear that the system will ultimately fail to improve biosecurity measures, but will instead burden farmers and hobbyists with paperwork and potential inspections. Sustainable livers argue that policies like the poultry registration law are particularly harmful to those trying to live in harmony with nature. The small-scale organic farming practices that many off-grid and sustainable livers adhere to often result in healthier animals and a lower risk of disease transmission, thanks to free-range methods, natural diets, and more attentive care of individual birds. These individuals believe that their environmentally conscious methods should exempt them from the same rules applied to large-scale commercial operations, which can have higher disease risks due to the crowded and controlled conditions under which poultry is kept. For many, keeping chickens and other birds is a crucial part of creating a closed-loop system in which animals and plants benefit from one another. Poultry provides manure, which can be composted to enrich soil, and in return, birds are fed scraps from vegetable gardens. These integrated systems allow for greater food security, reduce waste, and minimize dependence on industrial agriculture. Sustainable bird keepers argue that government interference could disrupt this delicate balance. Moreover, some within the community see this law as part of a broader pattern of policy decisions that favor industrialized farming and large-scale operations over small, local, and sustainable agriculture. They feel that instead of supporting people who are trying to reduce their environmental footprint, the government is imposing blanket regulations that undermine self-reliance. While the intent of the law is to protect public health by improving the government's ability to manage avian diseases, the backlash from those living sustainably raises important questions about how to balance national biosecurity with personal freedoms. Supporters of sustainable living argue that small-scale bird keepers who use traditional and organic farming methods should not be subjected to the same regulations as industrial farms, which have far higher risks of disease outbreaks. The government, on the other hand, maintains that avian diseases do not discriminate based on the size of a flock or the method of farming, and that comprehensive registration is necessary to ensure a coordinated and effective response in the event of an outbreak. They argue that failing to regulate small flocks could leave dangerous gaps in the country's biosecurity measures, especially as bird flu and other diseases continue to pose threats to both animal and human health. As mentioned, many of the individuals who are protesting the new UK law requiring the registration of poultry and captive birds see it as part of a larger government agenda to control food production. This belief, prevalent among sustainable livers, homesteaders, and small-scale farmers, stems from a growing suspicion that government policies are increasingly designed to centralize food systems, leaving little room for individual autonomy or alternative small-scale farming practices. For those who choose to raise their own food, whether it be poultry, livestock, or crops, this legislation represents yet another attempt to regulate, monitor, and ultimately control how food is produced and distributed. At the heart of these concerns is the belief that the government, through regulations like the poultry registration law, is systematically working to assert control over food production by marginalizing small independent producers. The industrialization of agriculture has already created a system where large corporations dominate food production, from factory farming to commercial seed distribution. Many in the sustainable living community argue that these corporations work hand in hand with the government to create policies that make it harder for small-scale farmers and hobbyists to maintain their independence. These individuals fear that by forcing all bird keepers to register, the government is slowly creating a system where small-scale, sustainable food producers will face increasing scrutiny and regulation. They argue that once the government has a detailed registry of who is keeping birds and where, it could lead to more stringent regulations that disproportionately affect small producers. For example, future laws could mandate how birds must be kept, what they are fed, or what medical interventions are required, regardless of whether a person has 2 chickens or 2,000. This fear is compounded by the belief that the government, through these regulations, is slowly making it impossible for people to raise their own food without bureaucratic interference. Many individuals who live sustainably have expressed concerns that the government's ultimate goal is to consolidate food production into the hands of a few large corporations, making independent food production increasingly difficult. By doing so, they argue, the government and big agricultural businesses can exert control over what people eat, how it is produced, and at what cost. This shift would undermine self-sufficiency and the local food movements that many see as vital to reducing environmental impact and promoting healthier, more ethical farming practices. The poultry registration law has reignited debates about food sovereignty, the right of individuals and communities to control the production, distribution, and consumption of their food. For many sustainable livers, being able to raise their own food including poultry, is a crucial aspect of food sovereignty. They value the independence that comes with growing their own vegetables, raising chickens for eggs, and avoiding the industrial food system that they see as harmful to both the environment and public health. With the introduction of this new law, many feel that their food sovereignty is under threat. Registration requirements, they argue, open the door for further restrictions that could eventually make it difficult, if not impossible, for small-scale producers to continue raising their own food. The fear is that by registering their birds, they are giving the government the power to regulate their personal food production practices in ways that could undermine their autonomy. Future regulations could include mandatory vaccinations, regular inspections, or limits on the number of birds one is allowed to keep, all of which would disproportionately affect small-scale, independent food producers. For those living sustainably, the ability to control how they feed themselves and their families is not just about practical food production, it's about the values they hold. Many choose to raise their own poultry or grow their own food as a way to opt out of an industrialized system that they view as environmentally destructive, unsustainable, and unhealthy. They take pride in knowing exactly where their food comes from and in the ethical treatment of their animals. To them, government regulation in this space feels like a threat to these deeply held values and an attempt to bring them back into a system they have intentionally chosen to leave behind. Many who oppose the poultry registration law believe that it is not just about biosecurity, but part of a broader agenda to centralize food production and place it under the control of large agribusiness corporations. They point to the ever-growing influence of companies that dominate the global food supply chain, from seed and pesticide manufacturers to large-scale meat processors. These corporations have historically benefited from government policies that prioritize efficiency and mass production over small, sustainable operations. Critics of the law argue that the government, under pressure from these powerful corporations, is gradually introducing measures that make it harder for small, local farmers to compete. The poultry registration law, while framed as a biosecurity measure, is viewed by some as the beginning of a slippery slope toward more draconian controls that could ultimately benefit large producers at the expense of independent small-scale ones. By tightening regulations on small bird keepers, critics argue, the government is nudging people away from self-sufficiency and toward reliance on corporate food production. This concern is particularly acute in the context of ongoing discussions about food security, sustainability, and climate change. As governments and corporations push for more controlled, centralized food systems in response to environmental challenges, many sustainable livers worry that their small-scale efforts to produce food in environmentally responsible ways will be marginalized or even outlawed. The emphasis on efficiency and large-scale production in industrial agriculture is often seen as incompatible with the slow, organic, and regenerative practices that sustainable livers value. For many individuals protesting the poultry registration law, their resistance is rooted in a broader distrust of government intentions. They feel that governments are increasingly encroaching on personal freedoms and that laws like these represent a form of creeping control over private life.